All right, now we're looking at Standard 8, which is the modern era in American history. We're going to start with 8.1, which is the modern civil rights movement. In this unit, we're going to look at the African American civil rights movement. We're going to talk about some of the initial strategies, the landmark court cases like Brown versus Board of Education, different laws that were passed. We're going to talk about the roles of key civil rights advocates in the media and the influence of the civil rights movement on other groups seeking equality. The civil rights movement didn't just happen. Its success was not an accident. It's been a constant movement of equality for African Americans since the beginning of the United States. We talked about it as early as like abolition movement. Then we talked about it again during Reconstruction. And then we talked about it again after during the Progressive Movement and Booker T. Washington and W.B. Du Bois. We talked about it again right after World War II. So it's been a progressive movement from the beginning. Society has changed. The Supreme Court has changed. And so that's caused changes in the movement to happen. The African American civil rights movement of the modern era challenged the status quo of race relations in the United States. The purpose of the movement is to secure the full rights of citizenship, including the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The goal of the movement was to get equal treatment and the right to vote. And it's going to be a little bit different in the 1960s from previous time period, mainly because of TV, which I'll talk about later. There have been many failed promises that established the context for the civil rights movement. If you look at all these different things that had happened, kind of like what I talked about before, these different things in American history to try to give African Americans rights, and they don't do it, like the Declaration of Independence, Reconstruction, the Jim Crow era, and then the responses of African Americans to discrimination through like the Harlem Renaissance and W.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington. So there's kind of been a push for civil rights for a long time in American history. So it's important to understand it didn't just happen out of nowhere. Some reasons for the post-World War II civil rights movement is that African Americans demanded more equal treatment during the war. African Americans had served during the war, like we talked about the Tuskegee Airmen. Some of the returning veterans were lynched, so it's kind of hard to say that we're fighting for freedom and liberty overseas when these returning veterans are being treated so badly over here. In fact, one of the big parts of it is right down there at the kind of in the middle where it says President Truman established the Civil Rights Commission, supported an anti-lynching law, and desegregated the military by executive order. He's the first president to really help civil rights, and that was a big deal for him to be able to desegregate the military. The Cold War was a competition that required the U.S. to gain support from emerging nations in Asia and Africa. And so it looks kind of bad, the fact that we're trying to stress liberty and freedom overseas during the Cold War and say that we're like the better country. But then when you look at how African Americans are treated over in the United States, and that doesn't really look like it's the case. There are lots of different strategies that were used during the civil rights movement that we're going to talk about, and those strategies are going to force the U.S. to live up to its constitutional promises. And one thing is going to be the fact there are TV cameras there. Television is a relatively new invention. Really, most households started getting TVs in the 1950s, and so you can't hide their actions because the TV cameras are filming what's going on. So let's talk about some of the strategies of the Southern movement. And the movement is broken between the Southern and the Northern. The Southern movement had its roots in the development of organizations like the NAACP. They tried to use the court system to fight discrimination. The strategy led to Brown versus Board. And if you remember what Brown versus Board, it was a huge victory for the civil rights movement. Basically what was said was that you couldn't have separate schools, that separate but equal is wrong, because in reality, separate but equal never happens. Yeah, you'd have like a white school and you'd have an African American school, but the African American school would be pretty bad. And so that's going to be like the start, that's kind of going to be the start of the civil rights movement through a court case, Brown versus Board of Education. Most of the South fights it. And some use this as your National History Day project. And you showed that the South is going to fight against segregation or against desegregation. And there's lots of good stories about that we'll talk about in class. And most of the whites in the South tried to block the implementation of desegregation. There's really good stories about like Emmett Till that show just how bad and how brutal the South was. Another strategy was direct action. They didn't just happen, they were planned in advance. They picked these sites specifically to show the nation and the world the face of racism. Remember the fact that TV cameras are going to be there capturing the whole time. And so they pick where they're going to go for a reason. So let's talk about some of those events. The first was the Montgomery bus boycott. And of course you know about the Montgomery bus boycott because you know about Rosa Parks, and that Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a segregated bus. This was planned well in advance. Rosa Parks was not the only woman who did this at the time. There was actually another woman who did it as well. And this actually is going to lead to, after her arrest, that's going to lead to a bus boycott where the African Americans in the city are not going to ride the buses. And it's going to lead to a lot of marches. And that's really like the power of it's going to come from the passive or the civil disobedience part of it, where the African Americans are going to march and they're gonna hold rallies. And meanwhile, like the Ku Klux Klan and the whites that are opposed to this are going to strike out against them. And they're gonna throw bombs at the organizers' homes, and it's really gonna make it look like the African Americans are doing nothing wrong, while the Ku Klux Klan and the white people who are protesting are doing something wrong. Here are some pictures of the Montgomery bus boycott and Rosa Parks. Another big part of the civil disobedience was done through sit-ins, and actually one really important sit-in actually happened in Rock Hill, with the Friendship 9 at McCrory's lunch counter. What they would do is that there would be segregated lunch counters where blacks and whites couldn't eat together, and so what they do, like these college students would go in, they'd sit at the counters, and even though there were not supposed to be African Americans at the counters, they would sit down. And so what would happen is then those people would get attacked for sitting at the counters, and there was press there to show it, and that's what made it look really bad. And here's some pictures from it. I mean, imagine you're opening a newspaper in the North and you're seeing what's happening in the South. You can't deny that there's a problem. And the Friendship 9, that was a group that happened in Rock Hill, and they were arrested, and very famous story. Another thing that happened during the Civil Rights Movement were freedom rides. Basically, buses were supposed to be segregated, so these buses, they'd actually start in the North, and they'd be desegregated, and then they would move, they would come down to the South, and as they got down to the South, there was lots of violence, and it was really like the violence is what helped show that the African Americans were in the right and that they were innocent, while the people who were committing the violence, the whites and the Ku Klux Klan, were in the wrong. And here's an example of the freedom ride, and you see it's both white students and black students that took part in this. And here's an example of some of the violence that occurred. You can see the students at the bottom that were arrested for riding on a bus together when they weren't supposed to by law. Another important event is the Birmingham campaign. Birmingham is the largest city in Alabama. It was notorious for segregation and racial hatred. So they started a campaign which they called Project C. They ended up having marches. They ended up having marches and protests, and they even got children to march, and so it was the Children's March. And the problem that happens for them is that it's shown on TV, and that actually helps the African Americans. That helps them with their cause. Horrified Americans see it all in the news. Protesters fill the jails, and it ends up being like a huge deal. You would not have had success. African Americans would not have had success without the television cameras and the newspaper cameras there recording it all. I mean, look at these pictures. You can't deny that there was a problem in Birmingham. You can't say that African Americans are being treated fairly. I mean, just look at the brutality. Another huge event, which you all know, and I'm sure, but I Have a Dream speech, was the March on Washington. More than 200,000 Americans gathered in Washington, D.C. for a political rally. And of course, that's where Martin Luther King gave his famous speech. And there's some pictures from the rally. That's going to draw attention to the movement, which is what the whole civil disobedience is all about. Freedom Summer is another important event. Basically, what happened is this was in Mississippi. It was illegal to try to get African Americans to vote. Sorry, it wasn't illegal. It was just African Americans had a hard time getting the right to vote because people would, if you tried to register to vote and you were African American, you might get beat up or lynched or something bad might happen to you. So what happens in Freedom Summer is the civil rights activists, they go and try to get African Americans registered to vote. And there ends up being a lot of violence as a result of that. And so they start a boycott in downtown stores to try to get more people to vote. And there's a lot of violence that occurs because of that. And there's a really famous story that's actually on here at the bottom of this, where three people end up killed and they get buried, and they were from trying to register people to vote. And so if you're reading this up north, you're seeing like all the bad stuff that's happening. You can't deny that there's a problem. Here's some pictures from Freedom Summer right here. Another important event was the Selma March. This is again Martin Luther King Jr. and his Southern Christian Leadership Conference. They make Selma the focus of their efforts to register African Americans to vote. And of course, there's going to be protests about not having the right to vote. The National Guard is there watching it. And they have a very historic march, and lots of pictures get taken, and they do accomplish a lot of their goals. Here's some pictures from the Selma March. This is really like the huge point right here. The media played an integral role in this movement. They were peaceful protests. African Americans, they were just marching peacefully. They're the ones, and then they become the victims. They didn't fight back. The news media captured all of this. And so if you're watching this in the North, like I've said a couple of times already, you can't deny that there's a problem. They're being denied the rights that all of us have based off of just being born. If we go back to the Declaration of Independence and John Locke, look at all the pictures that we've seen. These are pictures that America was seeing both in the newspapers and on television at the time. That's very powerful. They gained the sympathy of Americans and of politicians, and especially the president. And so it's going to lead to some different things getting passed to help them. Of course, Martin Luther King Jr. is the leader of the movement. He's kind of the face of the movement, but he's not the only leader. There are other movements too. And he's kind of the one who sets that strategy of nonviolence, which he took from Gandhi. Like I said, it'd be hard to look at these images and deny that African Americans had been and were being mistreated in the South. You can't say that. They are obviously being mistreated by all of those. You can see that in all those pictures. The presidents were able to get legislation passed that furthered the rights of African Americans, and we're going to talk about both of these two, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. However, even though those movements had widespread support, there are many who fought against the movement. There's actually someone in South Carolina by the name of Strom Thurmond who's going to run for president as a Dixiecrat, and the Dixiecrats opposed civil rights. So still, very popular in the South in the 1950s, 60s to be anti-desegregation. Democratic support of civil rights legislation and Nixon's Southern strategy is what's going to change the South from being Democrat to being Republican. Today, pretty much majority of white Southerners vote Republican. That changes because of civil rights that were supported by Kennedy and Johnson that were Democrats, and because they supported Nixon as the Republican. Changes in the movement also affect public support for civil rights legislation. There was attention switched from the South to the urban North, and in the North it's a very different movement. Those leaders included Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael and the Black Panthers. The Northern movement was different than the Southern movement because the problems were different. Southern activists could confront segregation that was by law. There were laws that said African Americans and whites couldn't go to school together. In the North, it's more of de facto, where it's by practice. Like they chose to live in different areas of the city. While the media was positive in the Southern movement, it hurt the movement with their reports of urban riots in the North and the radical rhetoric of the Black Power movement, and alienated the general public and undermined support for further government action in the North. That's not to say the entire movement was a negative. Black Power advocates did a lot to protect and empower the African American community and promote ethnic pride. However, the Northern movement was seen as being a lot more violent and a lot more racist, and we'll certainly watch some clips of Malcolm X and you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. Here are some famous pictures from the Black Power movement. One happened at the Olympics. Actually, the two guys that they were first and second, they ended up not being able to run the rest of the Olympics because they did that. The Olympic Committee said it was a disrespect, that they were being disrespectful. Here's some of the urban riots that happened in Detroit and Chicago. And like I said, it was a lot more violent than the South. The movement has a huge impact on the movement of others, like women's rights and the rights of Latinos. Many women participate in the civil rights movement. They saw some of the success, and so then they want to have some of that same success. A very famous book that you have to know about is The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan, which is going to energize a new generation of women, and they're going to start pushing for more equal rights. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 barred discrimination on the basis of gender as well as race. And then Roe versus Wade is going to happen, which makes abortion illegal. And then there's still a push for the Equal Rights Amendment, even though it's never passed. The goals, movements, and government responses to these movements were similar for the rights of Latinos and Native Americans. And these movements also lost support when they turned more militant. So the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, two important pieces of legislation that came out of that. Civil Rights Act was the one that started barring discrimination, and then the Voting Rights Act is going to bar discrimination in terms of voting. So both of those are very, very important to know. That concludes the video for 8.1. Please turn in the notes guide and take the video quiz.